My brothers and sisters in Christ, let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts here be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The text for our sermon this morning is from that gospel reading we just heard in the Gospel of Luke, and we'll hear those words again in the course of our sermon. My brothers and sisters in Jesus, this morning we're just going to cut right to the chase. In this well-known parable from Jesus, we see two characters, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Two very different men, two very different attitudes. For many of you, chances are that as you heard this reading this morning, you probably began to associate with either one of these two men. Maybe you saw yourself in the Pharisee, realizing that the times that you have where you deal with that sinful pride. Or maybe you saw yourself in the tax collector, as one who is in need of God's mercy. In essence, when we hear this parable, our first thought is to ask, which man am I? My brothers and sisters in Christ, I am here to tell you this morning that you are neither. You aren't just the Pharisee. You aren't just the tax collector. You are both. As baptized, believing children of God, there are times in our lives when our sinful pride flares up, and there are times where we find ourselves humbled by God. As we know, we are sinner and saint. We have that new nature within us, and we have that old Adam that struggles against that new nature in Christ. And when we see ourselves in this light, when we look at this parable in this light, we see a much fuller picture than if we were to pick one or the other that we are. The parable goes from simply being, be like this and don't be like this, to where are you right now? Where does that sinful pride creep in? Where do I go when those sins overwhelm me? How does God's mercy come to me, a sinner, when I cry out in times of need? That's the difference in the picture. So these questions are much more helpful to us, and even more importantly, they point us back to Christ in our lives, rather than a simple lesson of what's right and what's wrong. So with that foundation being laid, let's turn to the parable itself and dive into a little more of what Christ is saying. Jesus paints the scene for us in this parable as one that would have been very familiar to his readers who first heard this. Two men who were praying in the temple. Chances are that this would have been during the time, one of the two times in the day, where the worshipers would gather together for public prayer. Unlike our time of prayer here, where the pastor will lead each petition and the congregation then makes it its own by asking God to hear our prayer, or Lord in your mercy, hear our prayer, any one of our petitions we may have. In Jesus' day, it wasn't like that. Each of the worshipers would come and together they would offer their own private prayers aloud. So during the time of prayer, you hear all these voices and all these prayers being offered. And the Pharisee in this offers one prayer, the tax collector another. Notice the content. It's hard not to notice the content of the Pharisee's prayer. It starts off sounding actually pretty good for the first few words. If you're just hearing Jesus tell this, you'd probably think, hey, that's a great way to start a prayer. God, I thank you. But what spilled out from his mouth next is very hard for us to imagine. The Pharisee doesn't thank God for his goodness and mercy. He doesn't thank God for the gift he's received. He thanks God for himself. God, I thank you that I am me. Thank you that I'm not like all these other men. To make matters worse, he's not just thinking this in his heart. He's actually praying this prayer aloud. He sets himself apart from all the other worshipers, standing off to the side, probably as all are gathered standing in the temple. But he does so well within earshot, so that all the rest can observe his devotion to God. This prayer that he offers is all about impressing others. Which leads us to an important point. Remember back to the beginning of the parable? What was the first thing that was recorded for us? Look at verse 9. It says, Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. That's the key to unlocking this parable. So if this man's prayer was to impress others around him, we should probably take some time to ask ourselves that same question. What things in our lives as Christians are we doing so that others may notice? Now, I'm guessing that most of us don't start out doing good works with the intention of getting noticed by others. Most of the time, that new nature within us looks for ways to serve our neighbor. Whether it's through any of the current outreach projects we have going on that the LWML is leading us in, whether it's something else, whether it's volunteering at the thrift store or doing things for family, whether it's taking care of a spouse, looking after grandchildren, whether anything we do in our daily lives, this is all a gift of God, a way to serve others. In big ways, public ways, in small ways, all these things are the good works that God has prepared beforehand so that we can walk in them. Now, when we think about these things, it's unfortunate, but sometimes, oftentimes, sin can creep in, even into these things that are started with a good conscience and with godly motivation. As I reflected on this text this week, I know for myself, I've had to face up with the fact that sometimes I find myself, without even realizing it, maybe going on about the things that happened during the week. And I was doing this, and then we had that going on, and then we had to run to this other thing. And it wasn't until I read this parable, as I said, that I realized without even knowing, I may have been doing the same thing as the Pharisee. Not that I was somehow thinking of myself as better than another, but instead, in sharing those things, maybe even unconsciously, I was trying to shore up my own insecurities. But the problem was, I had turned Pharisee. I was wanting to be noticed for the good works because, like many of us, as we struggle with sin, I struggle sometimes to find my confidence in my identity in Christ and not in my work. Now that's just a small example from my own life. And I'm sure that each of you can think of many ways in your own lives where you find yourselves doing similar things, maybe not even realizing it. For example, maybe you don't get the thanks you feel you deserve for doing something, so you stop doing it. There's no recognition, so now the good that you've done turns back on itself. And then we find the heart of the Pharisee within us. Now, should that thanks come? Most certainly. But whether or not it comes, the neighbor still needs the good works that you're doing. So you don't do good works to get noticed, but for the well-being of others. We could go on with all kinds of different ways in which our sinful hearts want to get noticed for our good deeds. For our glory, not for Christ's. And the point is this. I think you get it. That this parable that we hear this morning is for each one of us. When your heart is like this, when you find yourself, when you trust in yourself that you're righteous, when you look down on others, we need to hear that judgment. I tell you that this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified, rather than the other, the Pharisee. That punch in the gut brings us back to our place. It reveals that that old sinful nature is acting up once again. Leads us to see ourselves as we are. Leads us to cry out, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. This is what the tax collector had said. Like us, he knew his sin. He knew the ways he had used others for his good, the way he had sought to get noticed, the times when he was thankful for himself rather than thankful for the good gifts of God. And so, aware of this sin, the tax collector cried out, not even looking to heaven, God be merciful to me, the sinner. You may have noticed that each time I've said that phrase, the last couple times, I've said, God be merciful to me, the sinner. In Greek, this subtlety really comes out, even though it doesn't fully in this English translation we have. This man, this tax collector, didn't just see himself as a sinner. He saw himself as the sinner. Furthering the point of the parable, he didn't look around to compare himself to other sinners. Being a sinner implied that he was one of many who was not so bad. But that wasn't his focus. He looked at himself and said, I am the sinner. What others do around me isn't my concern. I have sinned against God. And so I need His mercy. I need His grace. I need His forgiveness because I am the sinner. My brothers and sisters in Christ, you too this morning have made that confession. If you noticed, I intentionally picked a divine service setting for this morning because what do we say before our words of the confession? God be merciful to me, a sinner. You made those words your own as you confessed then your sin to God this morning. You have taken them as your own. And as you have confessed those sins to God, you hear those words of forgiveness for yourself. This is exactly what happens in our parable. The sinner goes home justified. You too, my brothers and sisters, will leave this place. You will go home justified today. You will go home covered in the blood of Christ by His death and His resurrection for you. Covered in the mercy of God for sinners like you and sinners like me. What does justification mean? It means it is just as if I had never sinned. In God's sight, through Christ's death on the cross, He no longer sees that sin within any of us, but sees us as His forgiven children, the child of God that we are. Sinner and saint, most certainly. Pharisee and tax collector, most definitely. But above all, forgiven child of God. That is who you are, and that is who you will be, for now and all eternity, as you live in the love and the Savior, Jesus Christ. In His name, amen. And I pray that that peace of God that surpasses all understanding would guard and keep each one of your hearts and minds as you live this week and every week in Christ our Lord. Amen.